Hello Steelers, and welcome to this building video. In 2021 I bought a new building from Sarissa Precision which I was going to make in October's Terraintober challenge over on Twitter, but it never got completed. However, I thought I'd get it finished for my ongoing Malaya project. This is from Sarissa's Colonial North African range, but the Islamic style of architecture will fit perfectly well in Malaya. It's a nice little office or a hotel style building, and it'll be a nice centrepiece for somewhere to defend or to attack. I'll put links in the description for all the things that I used in this build. As with all Sarissa products, it comes with good and clear instructions, and it's packed with detail even for a laser cut MDF product. How they managed to fit everything onto an A4 sheet is beyond me, but they must be working magic. Removal from the sprue is a very simple process, with the sprue joints only being small, but I would recommend using a sharp knife just to clean up the remnants of those joints. With the parts removed and cleaned, I then began dry fitting the basic construction together. Some of these parts were a little thin, so I took care not to snap any of the MDF at this stage. The parts fit together really easily and importantly tightly, so the structure has some strength straight away. Once the basic frame was in place, I used an old and mid-sized brush to begin adding PVA glue. I know some people use super glue on their MDF kits, but here I was using PVA as it's a good bond for wood and it is easier to work with over larger areas than super glue. Using the brush, I made sure to get right into the corners and the recesses, especially where the joints were. Don't worry too much about the glue stains here because we're going to be covering all this up with paint later anyway. Then it was time to start fitting the door and window decoration. These are separate card pieces, cut to shape and easily punched out and cleaned up with a knife. Be careful though, as these can be a little bit messy from the laser cutting process, and the residue can get on your hands. I'd recommend wearing gloves if you don't want to have to go and wash your hands afterwards. After checking the instructions carefully to which pieces went where, I used PVA glue again just to secure these parts into their places. Again, the fit was nice and very tight and it felt very secure. There are further pieces for another layer of window and door decoration which really make this kit pop, and these were simply added in the same way as the outer parts. Just a bit of PVA glue brushed into the right areas. Nice and simple. After putting the roof and the first floor of the kit together in a similar fashion to the ground floor, I then left the glue to dry. This didn't take too long, but I'd let it sit overnight to allow the glue to get into the joints and bond properly. I then turned my attention to the base as I waited for the PVA to dry. I wanted to use a piece of 3mm thick plastic card for the building's garden, as this doesn't warp and it's hard wearing for the tabletop. I also had some 3D printed walls which Paul at Sabotaged had sent me, and these were perfect for a high walled compound around this type of office building. It was simply a case of placing the building where I wanted it and then checking that the walls would fit around it. Once I was happy with the position of the buildings and the walls, I began gluing the walls down with super glue. I had to clean the edges of the walls just to ensure a tightish fit together, but I wasn't too worried as we'll deal with this later anyway. Then, using a ruler and a sharp knife, I scored along the edge of the wall to cut the plastic card down to size. Doing it after the walls are in ensured that I'd not mismeasured and made the base too small. Once scored, the plastic card was snapped along that scored line. I then checked everything was looking good with the building in place. By now, the building had dried sufficiently, so it was time to start painting. I was going to use my airbrush for the initial shading, but I'd been having difficulties with it, so it was on the naughty step for now. Instead, going outside and using a rattle can, I sprayed the interior black, as I don't like unpainted interiors. I'll revisit this in time, but I just wanted to get a nice primer coat down for now. Then I sprayed the windows and the doors and other recesses in black just to pre-shade it. As I said, this would have been better off with my airbrush, but that. This can be quite rough, but I just wanted some basic pre-shading in place. Then I took a rattle can of white and gently sprayed the exterior walls, passing over several times to build up the layers, but to still show some of the pre-shading below it. I didn't want a flat white surface, but something with a little texture, and this was a simple way of achieving that. Once the spray was dry, I started working on some of the details. I didn't want to go overboard with this kit, just enough to make it stand out, so that meant painting the doors and the window frames. For this, I used Vallejo's Intermediate Green. You can also see how the light spraying of the white over the black pre-shade had really picked out the scored details on the model as well. I'm afraid I didn't show you this, but I painted the interior floors in flat brown and the walls in light yellow. With all the details painted, I then began the process of weathering. Using a brush, I added Grime by Flurry Wash. This is a clay wash that works really well for weathering buildings. I just use a largish brush, cover the entire model in the wash and let it work into all the nooks and crannies, and then let it dry overnight. As the wash dried, I went back to the base and began adding polyfiller to fill in the joins between the walls and the bases. I just added this with a small flat-headed screwdriver and wiped off any excess with my finger. This would just help disguise the joint between the base and the walls. You could cover it with flock as well, but I wanted to be sure here because I wasn't sure what I was going to do with this part of the build at this point. As the polyfiller dried, I marked out the place where the building was going to go in the compound with a pencil, and then I cut up some embossed plastic card to make a small path for the front of the garden. This was then checked that it fitted into the area that I intended it to go, and I glued it in place with some polystyrene cement. Then I put the base to one side so that all the bits and the pieces could dry, and I turned back to the building. Now the clay wash had dried, it was time for it to do its magic. Dipping a soft cloth in clean water so that it was damp, I began wiping the clay wash off the model. Using downward strokes to simulate where the water and grime would drip, the wash begins to lift off, leaving some in the recesses where grime would naturally accumulate. How much you leave on and how much you take off here is entirely up to you, but I wanted a building that had got the faded memory of colonialisation along with some bad upkeep, so I was happy to keep it quite grimy. The next step was more weathering, using watercolour weathering pencils. I dip the tip in water and draw in where I want more weathering. Then using a small brush I'll streak lines down the building where a burst drain may have been or an accumulation of dirty water will run down the walls. The good thing with pencils is that you can get them into the desired place easily and they don't make a mess. As the roof is the most obvious part of the building when it's on the tabletop, I wanted to do something with it. I had painted the flat part in grey, but it needed some texture and interest on there. Flat areas can be hard to weather, so I went with weathering powders for this, simply because they add a slight texture to an otherwise flat area. I used an old brush and then just moved them around on the roof where I wanted them, mostly in the corners and a few places in the centre where people may have been walking. Then I used weathering powder fixer to hold them in place. I'm sorry I didn't film this, but it was a very simple process. So with the main building finished, it was time to turn back to the compound area. I painted the walls in brick red, making sure to cover everything with this. I got right into the nooks and crannies and the corners of the brickwork as well. I slightly watered the paint down just to help with this, so it just makes it flow a little bit better. I painted the capping stones in stone grey once the bricks had dried, and then I turned my attention to the mortar between the bricks. Now this is an incredibly way of achieving this effect, rather than painting white first and then dry brushing red brick. Using the Flurry washes again, I used the white wash and covered the walls in it, making sure the bricks were entirely covered. And then I let it dry for a while. Using the same technique as before with a wet cloth, I wiped off the wash, leaving only the remnants in the recesses between the bricks. I was careful not to take off too much wash here, as I wanted there to be some obvious mortar. Also, it helps because the bricks are never a uniform colour anyway, so this just helps them to give a bit of difference. I wanted to give the wall an appearance that it had been painted but not been maintained for a while, and the easiest way to achieve this was to apply white paint with a ripped up sponge. I dabbed the sponge in the paint and then stippled it across the surface of the wall. This is a good way of doing chips on vehicles, and it also looks like faded and crumbling paint on this wall as well, and it also gives the model a little bit of story. Once I'd got enough white paint on the wall to my liking, I went back and I repaired any splashes on the capping stones that I'd done in the process of the wall painting. I sealed the wall with matte varnish at this point, as the weathering stage was still not completed just yet. The reason for sealing with varnish was because I was going to use Flurry washes again, and I didn't want the original white one to reactivate again. This time I used grime wash and I covered everything in it, including the stone path at the front of the buildings and the walls. Then, using the same technique with the damp cloth, I wiped off the excess wash, leaving it in recesses. And I know what you're thinking here. Why bother do the early stages with the mortar and the bricks if everything is just going to be covered up again? Well, at that point I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with the walls, and the faded paint idea struck me as it fitted better with the white of the house walls, and I could tie the whole model together. Besides, I know I've done it, and I know that they're there, so I know that I didn't cut corners. I went back with the watercolour pencils, and I used the same colours I had done with the building to add streaks here and there on the wall. I also used the same colour to tie the two structures together. Then at this stage we were moving into the final aspects of the build. It was time to start work on the gardens. For this I used Vallejo's earth paste, applied with a brush. This is a textured paint that works well as an earthy covering. You can get it in different colours, and this is the grey earth version. I ensured that I only went up to the area marked out where the house will sit, and I paid close attention to the join of the compound walls and the plasticard base, making sure just to add a slightly thicker amount of paste there. And then, before the paste dried, I glued the building's lower floor into place and made sure that the paste buttered up to the bottom of the building, making a seamless joint. Then, once this had dried overnight, I started work on the garden itself. For this, I began painting PVA glue all over the paste. To help this, you can water it down a little, just to help the flow, but I didn't really bother. Then I sprinkled static grass over the PVA. If you've got an applicator, you can use this, but I don't own one, and I've never really felt the need for one, to be honest. I then tipped the building upside down to get rid of the excess grass. Once the PVA is dried and the grass is firmly in place, I then started adding foliage. This is primarily to cover up the gaps in the walls. You'll remember those, and I told you we will be dealing with them eventually. These leaves are a railway modelling product I picked up years ago, but anything here will work, and these ones look like ivy or vines, the type you'd have growing in a garden. Again, this is just done with PVA glue painted onto the walls and then with the foliage sprinkled on top. Then it was time to finish off the model and add a little bit of colour in the form of flowers in the formal garden at the front of the building. I bought these from eBay and they're self-adhesives, so they're nice and easy to use and they just make things a little bit more interesting. And that was the building completed. In all, it took about a week from beginning to end, including drying times, and there was a nice enjoyable build with plenty of interesting bits of detail to work on. I'll be buying more of these Colonial buildings from Sarissa as I enjoyed this one so much, and they make a bit of a difference from just having jungle huts everywhere. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please hit the like button, leave me a comment. If you do want to help out the channel, please check out my Patreon and also channel memberships. You can also buy me a one-off tip on Ko-fi as well. It all goes back into making videos. Thank you very much for watching.